Hello, church. This is the first video in the second group of videos in this new video series that we're doing on the three offices of Christ, those offices being, as you can see, of prophet, priest, and king. If you watched our first three videos, we tackled the office of prophet, what a prophet does. We looked at a case study of a prophet in the Old Testament, Elijah, and then in the third video we looked at how Christ is the true prophet. Following that similar model, we're looking at the office of priest in these next three videos, and we're going to follow that same pattern. In this video, we're sort of giving the definition and looking at the role of what is a priest and what does a priest do in biblical terms. In the next video, we'll look at a case study of a priest in the Bible. And then we'll use those first two videos to look at the third video, which is how is Jesus Christ, the true priest, from all eternity? How does he fulfill that role even now perfectly in a way that the biblical priests could not? So with that, let's turn to some definitions. This is the Greek and Hebrew for priest. At the top there, hieros, which means a priest or one that makes sacrifices. Not a super common word in the New Testament, used 32 times, compared to the Old Testament, kohen, which just simply means priest, which is used 750 times. It's perhaps not surprising to us that priests are on the scene much more in the Old Testament than the New Testament, and you can probably get at some answers for why that might be, especially considering what the third video in this series is about. But there's not, similar to prophet, we don't have a trouble understanding what a priest does, because we have priests today that are often trying to do the same things that those biblical priests were trying to do. Here's what the office of priest is all about. Three things that a priest should be doing. The first is that they are a representative for God, or for man to God. Think about it like this. If prophets were the ones who were speaking from God to man, then priests are sort of the mediators between man and God, going the opposite direction. That is, they take the concerns of man to God. Prophets speak truth from God to man. Priests take the concerns of man to God. We see God establish the office of priest. This was God's idea, and it was God who set up these mediators in this office to function in this way, to represent man to God. You see there Exodus 28:1. Then bring near to you Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the people of Israel to serve me as priests. That is similar to prophets. Priests are people who were picked and called by God to function and serve in this way. So that's the first function of a priest, that they're representatives for man to God. The second function is that they were spiritually responsible for the people. You see there Leviticus 10, verses 10 and 11. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. Again, the importance of clean and unclean, what is holy and not, was in the priest's hands to determine, according to God's law, what was good or not, what was holy or not, and to lead the people in that way. That's what we mean by spiritually responsible for people. That they were the ones who were to know what was holy or not, and were to lead the people according to that. We also know that they had actual responsibilities in carrying out this law to the people. In Leviticus 16, for instance, we see clothing laws, sacrificial laws, food laws, all of those sort of laws and commands that we associate with the Bible, and in particular the Old Testament, those holiness codes. It was the job of the priest to enforce that and to teach the people what was clean, what was not, what was good, or what was not. We also see here part of their spiritual responsibility was teaching the people what these laws of God were. Malachi 2:7, "For the lips of a priest ought to preserve knowledge, and from his mouth men should seek instruction, because he is the messenger of the Lord Almighty." See, there a little bit of overlap with the office of prophet, don't we? Here we see the priest taking on a teaching role, speaking the truth of God to the people, in addition to representing man to God. And then the third function of a priest, perhaps what we most associate with a priest, is that they were to offer sacrifices for sin. So because of the knowledge they had of what was holy, what was not, what was clean, what was not, they were able to function in the sacrificial system that God put in place to make atonement for sin. So Leviticus 17:11, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is by the blood that makes atonement by the life." Also Hebrews 5 verses 1 through 4, I don't have a slide for this, but here's what we read in the New Testament. "Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was." So the author of Hebrews there really sums up everything that we've said to this point. I encourage you to go back and check out that passage. That's Hebrews 5, 1 through 4, talking about what a priest does. Here's a sum up of those three functions. Priests are representative of man to God. They're spiritually responsible for people, and they offer sacrifices for sins. Key word that we read there in the Leviticus passage, in Leviticus 17, was that word atonement. And that's really gets at the brunt of what a priest does, is that they make atonement for sin. By atonement, we mean to make right, to repair, reconciliation. So whenever we talk about being made right with God, when we talk about the wrath of God being satisfied, when we talk about being cleansed from our sins, all of those things that we associate with being saved by Christ, those are atonement words. In fact, we are saved because atonement has been made for sin. That's been the chief problem of humanity since the fall of Adam and Eve, right? That we are sinners, and because God is just, we deserve punishment for our sin. So atonement is how sin is paid for or dealt with so that God's people don't receive that punishment that is due them. Most fundamentally, that's what atonement is. It's that reconciliation word, being made right. And then this is getting a little bit theological, but these are the two sort of aspects or directions of atonement, and that is expiation and propitiation. And I just want to put these in your mind if you haven't heard them before, because it helps us understand what's happening whenever we are made right with God, when a sacrifice is made. So that, again, and this is dealing with two different directions. So expiation is the effect of atonement on the worshiper. That is, when our sin, our guilt, and our shame is removed, that means that it is expiated, it's taken away. The punishment that they deserve is laid on the substitute or the sacrifice. So that is, that sin is always paid for, right, in God's courtroom. Sin has to be paid for. God is just and will not leave sin unpunished. And so the sacrificial system was put in place so that those punishments could be paid for by the thing being sacrificed. That is, they paid for the sin. And so that idea of that, the guilt and the shame and the penalty of sin being taken away and put on something else, is expiation. And then that second word is propitiation. This is the one you may be more familiar with, but that's the effect of the atonement on God. That is God's justice and anger being satisfied. And that satisfaction is the key word there with propitiation. That is, because God is just, because he's angry at sin, that anger must be satisfied by sin being dealt with. And whenever that sacrifice is made, God's anger is propitiated. That is, it's sort of removed from him because it's been satisfied. He's no longer angry because the scales have been leveled because of the sacrifice. Perhaps a little technical there, but I think what's most important for us to take away from this, expiation, propitiation, under the umbrella of the atonement, is that God is perfect and just, and his books are always right? Nothing slips through the cracks. No sin goes unpunished that deserves to be punished. No one gets punished who shouldn't be punished. God is the perfect judge who fulfills his justice perfectly. And that's really what these words are starting to get at. That God's anger, his wrath towards sin, is actually paid for. That's what the sacrificial system is in place for. That sin would be dealt with. And that it's really a loving thing by God to give his people priests, to give his people the sacrificial system, because the individual people didn't have to pay for their own sins. But there was, in this case, an animal sacrifice that could be made that would pay for the sins. I've actually got a long quote here. This is by a guy named Stephen Wellum talking about this exact fact. Here's what he says. The Old Testament sacrificial system is a great demonstration of a whole number of truths about God, but especially his mercy. We think of it often in terms of the provision of the animals as substitutes for the people in order to satisfy God's displeasure, his condemnation, his wrath. Again, that's propitiation. But we also have to remember that the entire motivation of this is driven by his love, his mercy. When we think about his mercy, his pity towards us, tied to even his grace, where we have that which we do not deserve, the sacrificial system should not be viewed as the nation of Israel sort of making up this system in order to keep God on their side. No, this is God taking the initiative in love so that there would be a means by which he would be able to dwell with the nation. That is, his justice must be satisfied. He can't go against his own character. They would be able to dwell in his presence. They would be his people. He would be their God. All of that is demonstration of his mercy, of his love, of his grace. Spoiler here. And all of it eventually points forward to his provision in Jesus Christ, who is the fulfillment of this. We now have direct access to him through our great sacrifice, our Lord, Jesus Christ. So let me go back here to the functions of a priest. The priests are the ones who carried out this system, right? They were representatives of a man to God. They were spiritually responsible for the people, and they were the ones who God put in place to offer sacrifices for sins. This is what a priest does. It was an office that God put into place, and as we'll see in the next two videos, ultimately it's the office that Jesus fulfills perfectly for his people. So that's just sort of an intro, an overview of what a priest does. In the next video, we're going to look at a case study tracking the life and role of an actual priest in Old Testament Israel. We hope we'll see you then. Thanks.